Star Trek Insurrection was a disappointment. The blandest and most forgettable of the Star Trek The Next Generation movies. Dismissed by many as a glorified TV episode. But it didn't start out that way. The original vision had Picard matching wits with an old rival from his youth in a journey into the heart of darkness. The Enterprise crew battled old enemies and went to war over the very soul of the Federation. Let me tell you the story of what Star Trek Insurrection was meant to be, and how that vision was chipped away at piece by piece. Michael Piller was arguably the architect of TNG's success. He was the show's head writer and showrunner for most of its run. He assembled the core writing team, and his fingerprints are all over the greatest episodes and scenes of the series. Despite all this, when TNG went to the movies, he didn't get involved until the third one. As a TV guy, he was an outsider to the movie industry, and it was a big deal for someone like him to be put in charge of writing Star Trek IX. And he soon found that, compared to TV, there were a lot of chefs in the kitchen, and he had many masters to please. In his book Fade In, he writes, "Writers are puppet masters. We are omnipotent, as long as we stay in our dark little rooms. The moment we leave, we become mortal." Star Trek IX initially had the working title Stardust. It took a range of classic inspirations, most prominently from The Prisoner of Zenda, The Fountain of Youth, and The Heart of Darkness. The movie opens up at Starfleet Academy, where we learn that young Jean-Luc Picard had a best buddy, a rebellious young cadet called Hugh Duffy. Duffy is an old-school Captain Kirk type, who believes in spreading Federation values across the galaxy. Picard is new school and feels humanity should be more diplomatic and has a lot to learn from those it encounters. Cut to present day, and tensions are high on the neutral zone. A rogue Starfleet ship has been attacking the Romulans, and the prime suspect is Picard's old pal Duffy. His ship was believed destroyed years ago, but now it appears he wasn't as dead as he seemed. Has Duffy gone mad? Has he some agenda of his own? Picard is dispatched to a turbulent area of space called the Briar Patch to get to the bottom of it. It's Heart of Darkness in space. He's Willard heading up the river in search of Duffy's Colonel Kurtz, not sure what it is he'll find. Picard wrestles with regrets from his past, reflects on the rebellious spirit of youth gone by, and wonders if he can reconcile old differences with his estranged friend. Along the way, fan-favorite characters all get something to do. Data installed his emotion chip in an earlier movie. This time, he's accompanied on the mission by a gaggle of less advanced Soong-type androids. He has to adjust to being this object of hero worship, while confronting the differences between his current evolved state of being and the emotionless android he used to be. Worf also gets some love. During the mission, the crew have to work with an arrogant Romulan commander who rubs Worf the wrong way.
Well, if it isn't the play actor, with his tin sword, too.
He's a dastardly villain, an arrogant cad. Inspired by the character played by Douglas Fairbanks Jr. in Prisoner of Zenda.
I don't like women who lie to me. They don't usually do it, as a matter of fact. I usually lie to them.
He puts the moves on Troy, insults Worf's family, and bests him in combat, all setting up a worthy rival for Worf to dispatch in the final act. Eventually, Picard finds Duffy on a mysterious planet, and to his surprise, it appears like he hasn't aged a day since the Academy. The planet is a kind of fountain of youth due to MacGuffin ore beneath the surface. A conspiracy is revealed between the Romulans and the Federation. They plan to finalize a peace treaty and split the life-giving ore. All this time, Duffy has been protecting the alien natives on the planet from being exploited and forcibly relocated. Piller hadn't decided what the aliens would be like yet, but he promised they'd be very unique and very interesting. As this is all going on, the effects of the plant make the crew more youthful and rebellious in spirit, and various hijinks ensue. Duffy convinces Picard to go against Starfleet and stand up for his values. So the crew go rogue and fight a guerrilla war against the Romulans.
Lock and load.
They ultimately dispatch their pointy-eared foes and head to Earth to expose the conspiracy. Picard faces off against a Vulcan admiral in a war of words. Piller suggested Ian McKellen would make a good foil for Picard here. And it all culminates in a classic Picard speech before the Federation Council. The politicos are unmoved, but the gallery applauds. The people have spoken, and the crooked deal with the Romulans is dead. We end with the crew victorious, but facing charges for their actions. The movie closes with their fate uncertain. It's a solid story about the regrets and joys of youth, the rights of indigenous people against the big state, and some classic Trek with Picard putting everything on the line to stand up for his principles. With that, Piller handed in the story. Now, Rick Berman was a controversial figure among Star Trek fans back in the 90s. He was put in charge of the franchise after Gene Roddenberry, and under his watch, Trek was on TV for nearly 2 decades straight. On the other side, his critics say that under his leadership, the franchise stagnated, that with Voyager and Enterprise, it grew stale, and it failed to evolve. When Berman read Pillar's script, he had 3 notes. Notes that threatened to tear nearly the whole story down. The politics stuff is boring. Patrick Stewart will hate the Fountain of Youth stuff because it'll make him seem old, and having the Federation be the villains betrays one of Star Trek's core elements. That third one seems absolutely quaint today, when nearly every Star Trek story is about Federation people being evil. With those notes in hand, Pillar went back to the drawing board. The new rewrite loses the Duffy character and replaces him with Data. Data is now Kurtz. The Fountain of Youth stuff is also dropped. The ore is now simply a rare element in short supply needed for 24th century medical technology. Picard goes looking for Data, and the story unfolds much as it did before, with a few tweaks. Getting through the Briar Patch now requires getting help from a ragtag fleet of mariners, who come into play again later in the story. When they find Data, he appears to be malfunctioning and attacks. Picard is forced to destroy him, blasting his friend into pieces. The natives of the planet get fleshed out more in this draft. They're a group of little aliens that communicate telepathically by summoning visions of objects and images. There's a whole subplot of Picard trying to understand a small alien boy. He ultimately uses the holodeck to conjure images of his own, thus breaking the communication barrier. It's here where we discover the Romulans are the ones that damaged Data, when he discovered their illegal mining operation on the planet. We later learn the Federation are in cahoots with the Romulans, so the conspiracy plot is still intact. Admiral Dougherty is added as a new character who's a liaison with the Romulans, a representative of the Federation brass on the scene for Picard to spar with directly. The aliens later perform a strange ritual to resurrect Data, who is now his old self again. The crew go rogue and fight the Romulans, and in the final battle the Mariners show up to help. And it's here when the Romulans and Dougherty realize they've lost. Sure, they can relocate a bunch of faceless aliens, but they can't massacre 100 Federation citizens. The planet is saved, Picard and co escape charges, and the Enterprise heads off to the next adventure. Berman was happy, and so the story went off to the studio. There were 4 executives who weighed in on the story. 3 of them loved it, 1 didn't. He thought the villains sucked, the aliens sucked, the stakes were too small, no one likes the Romulans, and won't people think the Federation is right? Why can't they just move the aliens for the greater good? Before Pillar and Berman even had a chance to respond to any of this, they got an email from Patrick Stewart. By this point in Star Trek's run, Patrick Stewart had a great deal of clout. No one else was going to be playing Picard, so Stewart had a veto on anything he didn't like. And he hated this story. At a fundamental level, Stewart felt the movies and the series were very different beasts. Sure, the series was about exploration, character development, interpersonal relationships, thoughtful stories about diplomacy. That's all well and good for TV. But the movies had to be big, action-packed, and sexy.
I'm a sort of James Bond figure.
Right.
And I have to go to Iraq to rescue these hostages. And I get there and I rescue them. But they're all women and they're naked because their clothes have rotted off.
As far as he was concerned, we know these characters well enough already. Now we need to put big challenges in front of them to fight. He also felt fans would be disappointed with Data not appearing as his old self until very late in the movie. And he too thought the Romulans were old hat and didn't belong in the movies. The only things he really liked about it were the ragtag bunch of mariners and Picard waging a guerrilla war. In an effort to salvage something from all the work they'd done, Pillar and Berman mentioned the dropped Fountain of Youth plot. Maybe it could be the injection of humor, sex, and fun Stewart was after. Contrary to their earlier expectations, Stewart wasn't precious about his age or looking old. He loved the idea. So Pillar went to work on another draft, bringing back some of the older elements in a modified form. The Academy prologue is back, but Hugh Duffy is now Eleanor Duffy. The Romulans are gone. The Federation is now working with the Soni, which was later changed to Sona, a race of extremely old aliens. Worf's roguish antagonist is gone, replaced with a Sona leader fixated on harnessing the Fountain of Youth effects of the planet. And the ragtag mariners are out too. They failed to make the cut this time. Picard once again goes looking for Data, with Eleanor Duffy being among the officers who went missing along with Data on his mission. They reach the planet, Data attacks, but this time he isn't killed. Instead, he's disabled and brought back to his normal self relatively early in the movie. The crew become more youthful, and sparks fly between Picard and Eleanor. The aliens on the planet are totally different than before. The Baku are now a race who look like children, but are really hundreds of years old due to the magical properties of the planet. The conspiracy is uncovered as before, and it turns out Eleanor was in on it. There's a rift between her and Picard for a while, but she ends up doing the right thing and joins his insurrection against Starfleet and the Son'a. A twist is added at the end where the Son'a turn out to really be Baku. They were exiled from the youth planet because they embraced technology and exploration of the outside world. Picard brokers a peace between the two sides and rides off into the sunset. At this point, Piller figured he'd nailed it. But after getting input from Ira Steven Behr, the mastermind behind Deep Space Nine, there were a few more changes. He figured Picard needed more of an arc, a temptation to abandon his life of duty and remain on the planet. This meant cutting Eleanor Duffy and giving him a love interest among the Baku. This also meant the aliens had to look like grown-ups now, for obvious reasons. The Fountain of Youth effects also kick in sooner, on the way to the planet. That way they can get to the fun stuff earlier and create a sense of mystery about what's going on. The revised story was deemed a hit. All the cast were ecstatic and the studio loved it. With the script now more or less in its final form, Star Trek Insurrection went into production. Reviews were mixed, to say the least.
I'm sure this is not one of the stronger entries. One problem, the villains are below par. Another problem, the central question in the plot isn't very interesting.
That speech about relocating in the numbers is pretty profound and in the spirit of the Star Trek films, and it's more profound, let's say, than anything Yoda ever said.
I thought the evil Son'a people had a pretty good point. Why not relocate the 600 Baku people if that might mean health and long life for billions of Federation inhabitants? The whole movie, in fact, is less than compelling. It feels creaky as it grinds through a fairly standard plot.
The general consensus was, it wasn't awful, but it was pretty forgettable, and a big step down from what came before. It ended up feeling like an okay episode of the TV show, made on a big budget, not something necessarily worth the price of a movie ticket.
The story wasn't as strong as First Contact.
Which is bizarre, since that's the very thing Patrick Stewart had wanted to avoid and was convinced he had avoided when he read the final draft. In my view, a lot of the scale and intrigue that was there in the initial story got lost in the various rewrites. Visiting shadows from Picard's past would have made the stakes feel more personal, and we would have felt we were learning something new and consequential about the character. An epic showdown at the Federation Council would have made events seem bigger and more important, like this is something galaxy-shaking and not just a little adventure on one planet. And nobody loves Picard because he gets in fistfights, shoots phasers, and is irresistible to the ladies. He's an intellectual problem solver. Just let the man make a speech, for God's sake. The possibilities for the aliens seemed limitless in the early drafts, but they ended up just looking like regular, boring old humans by the time it hit the screen. And I don't care what Patrick Stewart and the studio suits say, the Romulans are well-liked and well-established recurring antagonists throughout the series. Their involvement would have lent the story some legitimacy. The Son'a felt like a villain of the week. Plus, ending the movie with an altered status quo, the crew facing charges and removed from duty, would have been a great hook for the next movie. It would have left people buzzing about something new and different happening, and wondering what would happen next. At the time, there was this idea that the even-numbered Star Treks were good and the odd-numbered ones were bad. That myth was soon dispelled by the next movie, which did have Romulans and was a total train wreck. It was the last Trek movie they'd make for another 7 years. And while the box office failure of Nemesis is blamed for temporarily killing Star Trek for a while, it's hard not to think that Insurrection was the beginning of the end. A big misstep that killed a lot of the excitement fans had for Star Trek on the big screen. But what do you think? Was there a good movie in there somewhere? Is any one person to blame for what happened? Let me know in the comments. That's all for this one. I'll be seeing you.